Book 35 of 2020 was The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins. So I have read 7 of Richard Dawkins' books now. They're a little bit hit and miss because they're all kind of at different intellectual levels. So I would say that this one's kind of a middling one. Not too complicated, not too easy. It's kind of like the Goldilocks of some of his books. This one is about evolution and natural selection, so it kind of expands, you know, your understanding of that. It's quite informative about that. It's the name basically comes from, if you've heard of the watchmaker analogy, which is William Paley was a theologian that suggested, if you're not familiar with it, that if you were to just randomly stumble across a watch, you would be able to infer from looking at that watch that because of its complexity and the cogs and all that kind of stuff, that it must have had a maker, a designer, and so therefore that was kind of his evidence for the existence of God. And I think that what Dawkins is doing is using that as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, because obviously Dawkins is very anti-God, to say the blind watchmaker, because yes, there is a designer, but the designer is evolution. So that's kind of what the name is like referring to, and that's actually what attracted me to the book, because I was aware of William Paley's theology before. So this has been on my to-read list for a very, very long time, probably like around the same time. I mean, the books that I've read of Dawkins are Selfish Gene, I definitely recommend that one. The God Delusion is probably my favourite, actually. I really like that one, although there's some things in there that I wouldn't necessarily agree with, but it's a very good discussion. There are some that I would avoid. I think, is it The Magic of the Rainbow, something like that, very easy, like GCSE basic kind of, but it's a good introductory into it if you're not really sure about any of the stuff that's discussed. I mean, I'm quite knowledgeable about science and stuff, so like at an entry level, so I find that like quite easy. Like, I remember my GCSE science, you know, I don't really need to be reminded of like basic stuff. And I actually read his Appetite for Wonder, which is an autobiography, I think. It must be, because it's by him. I was wondering whether someone else had written it, but my mum had bought that book for me because she knew that I was reading Dawkins, but I don't think she realised that I was interested in the actual stuff he was talking about rather than him. But he actually was quite good, and reading about his life gave me kind of an insight into him as a person, and also got me into reading more kind of like memoirs and things like that. So it was a good inroads to that. I mean, Dawkins is quite pompous and quite, he's quite patronising. He's very conversational, but he is informative and he does expand understanding. So this book, as I mentioned, is Evolution and Natural Selection. He does guide the reader through the arguments. It does it quite successfully. So whilst it's not necessarily academic, it is reasoned and argued, and he does a lot of reminding to the reader, which I don't really feel like I need, but I recognise that other people might need that if they're not really sure about what he's talking about, or it takes them a while to understand what's discussed or whatever. So, you know, it's not an inaccessible text, it's not a dense text, it's quite accessible, really, and I think that was kind of probably his purpose. I think a lot of the time as well, he writes about things that are not necessarily his area of speciality. Like, he is a biologist, but he does talk about, you know, other things, like in other books. Like, so for example, in the God Delusion I mentioned, there's a few things in there that he's not quite right about, but you can tell that he's kind of trying to access like other information that he's probably not as expert in, but he does it in a way that's kind of like experimental and scientific and whatever, which is his bag. I really enjoyed in this book learning about echolocation, and it was funny because I'd not understood echolocation as much as what this was explained as. Like, I knew it existed, but I didn't know as much about it, and it kept popping up everywhere else. I was reading Homo Deus, I think, and that mentioned it, but this book does it in a lot more detail and is a lot more, because obviously Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari is a bit brief, whereas this goes into a lot more detail. There's a whole chapter about echolocation, so that was very interesting. And also what was interesting was that I've read The Selfish Gene, and the Selfish Gene gives you kind of a theory about self-replicating genes and where they come from, and that theory is the primeval soup. So that, you know, there's a primeval soup of elements and all chemistry things from when we had the Big Bang, and it's all kind of like in this soup. And that from that, genes created more and more kind of complex ways to survive and created, you know, what we know today as the species of different animals and things. I didn't say that very well, but you know what I mean. And I just assumed that that was fact and that that was the only theory. But in this book, I keep holding it up and putting it down, but I should just keep hold of it. So in this one, it gives another theory, which is the inorganic mineral theory, which is like comparing self-replicating genes to minerals and how crystals develop. And I thought that that was really interesting, but in my mind it seems a bit of a jump to go from inorganic material to organic material, so like living things. So I was a bit like, I don't know if I like the primeval soup one's more a theory that I would go with, but the fact that he's provided another theory as a contrast to the other one makes me think actually we don't know these things. Like obviously there's evidence for and against for all of stuff, isn't there? But so yeah, it kind of made me think, oh, like I should maybe not accept what he's talking about because there are other theories. And I think that's actually a downside to his selfish gene, because he doesn't say in the selfish gene that this is just one of the theories, or at least I don't remember him doing. Whereas in this one, he's kind of addressing the fact that there are other theories, which would have been helpful in the selfish gene, and would have helped me because I wouldn't have thought that that was the only theory about self-replicating genes. He also, in this book, expands on the theory of cumulative selection. So he does allude to this in the selfish gene because he talks about the rowboat analogy, which is, I mean, there's no point me going into it. You can, you know, read it in the selfish gene, but it's essentially like where natural selection works on kind of genes and whether they get turned on or off, and whether, well, in alleles you've got like different things. So for example, eye colour, you've got like green and brown and I was gonna say orange, but that's ridiculous. I was thinking hazel, but I was like, I've already said brown. Blue. And so you could be one of those. So that's like, imagine like a rowboat, and you know, rowboat teams have like members and they each occupy a seat. So in, you know, an allele, like the green eyes will occupy the seat, and it talks about how certain genes get selected together, like in groups, which is what the cumulative selection is. So certain genes kind of group together and work together to like be selected and pass on through the generations. Obviously he's far more articulate about it than I am, and so he expands on that more, and also spends more time in this book kind of emphasizing mutations, because the thing about evolutionists, people seem to get it into their mind that when you evolve, that you evolve in a positive way and to benefit the species, because that's kind of what, when we look at animals that are specialised for environments, for example sharks, and how they're specialised for their environment and with the teeth that they got in and all that kind of stuff. But most of the time with species, when they're developing, it's a mutation that's happened, something that's like not expected and uncontrolled, and if it benefits the species it stays, and if it doesn't, well then that species, well, why am I saying species, that individual animal, if it benefits them, then they carry on selecting for that, and if it doesn't, well they die out and they can't pass it on to their offspring because they're dead. So he puts more emphasis onto this mutation and how that contributes, and how it's not as controlled and kind of like, you know, selected as you would think it would be before he kind of talks about it and explains it. He also made me kind of understand evolution a little bit better and deeper, in the sense of the kind of rate of evolution. So there's two kind of theories about this, gradualists, which suggest that, this is what my understanding of evolution was that there was gradual changes selected through individuals within the species, and that gradually they get more specialised or whatever to their environment, you know, to be fitter, if you will. And there's another theory, which is where it's called punctuationalists, which suggests that you evolve, but then there's periods of stasis where you don't evolve, where you just kind of stuck the same, which you would think may be reasonable, but maybe it's still graduationalists because it's just super slow gradualists that appears to be stasis. So this is what Dawkins is discussing, and he kind of favours more gradualists, which I do too, I would say, rather than these punctuationalists, because I think they're kind of the same thing, but they're just, like I mentioned before, that the stasis is actually just a super slow period. And also, you know, whether or not this speed is variable, you know, is it a constant rate? Does it go faster or slower depending on certain things? Is it reversible? Can it go backwards? You know, these are kind of things that I hadn't really thought about before. I just accepted, oh yeah, evolution and, you know, becoming more specialised to your environment, but actually you're relying on mutations and you're relying on cumulative selection. And so therefore, you know, you're not going to have a perfect rate of specialisation. There's going to be lots of, it becomes, I mean, I'm seeing it all in my head. It's all very complicated and it's very difficult to put into words because I'm visually thinking of it. But it got me thinking a lot about evolution, because I'd always assumed of this kind of arms race, because this, I think this has actually come from me reading the Selfish Gene. It's kind of created my understanding of evolution, and also because I read Darwin's On Origin of Species, and they're kind of quite similar. So this has kind of informed how I've thought about it, but this goes deeper and explains it in more intellectually, to actually think that we don't know everything about evolution, and there are lots of variables that we need to consider. So as I was mentioning there, an arms race, so, you know, for example, you've got prey and you've got predators, and so they both kind of specialise. So for example, you've got a gazelle and you've got a lion. Is it lions that go after gazelles? The gazelle will specialise to get faster so that they can outrun the lion, but the lion will also get faster, and you kind of, you know, you both kind of, you know, becoming fitter to actually works both ways, doesn't it? They are fitter, they run faster, but fitter in terms of evolutionary fitter, because you are trying to survive. And so, you know, arms races drive evolution, but what if there is no arms race? Does evolution still drive? Because you're still going to get mutations and you're still going to get this cumulative selection. And obviously I mean, I was just thinking then of those butterflies that try and, they've evolved to have camouflage so that they merge into like the environment, like trees and stuff like that, so they're quite brown. But that's because they're avoiding the prey. I suppose they're always going to be in that arms race maybe, but does that make it go faster? You know, is there more kind of evolutionary pressure? And then there's this idea, is, are the genes that are resistant to evolutionary change, do they exist? Do they create the stasis or the super slow graduation? I keep saying graduation, but I mean gradualist, you know, gradual incremental kind of change in a species. Like, there's loads of things that you could think about in terms of this. The conversation about taxonomy was also very interesting, because we obviously have an incomplete fossil record because of the way that, you know, sediment in the land, you know, around in rocks and things like that, you can only get fossils within sedimentary rock. So if there isn't any sediment, then you don't really have any fossils. I think that's right. I'm just thinking you can have it in magma and igneous rocks as well, can't you? I don't even know if that's the right word. I'm trying to recall my geography GCSE. But anyway, the fossil record is incomplete, and obviously you can't go right down to the bottom of the seabed in you know, in the Atlantic, for example, with the cleft that's there and stuff. Like, there's probably loads of fossils that we don't know about, and loads of things that haven't got fossils because of the way that the land is and the way that, you know, ice ages have happened and all that kind of stuff. Like, there's loads of reason why we haven't got this fossil record. And this means that we appear to have discrete species. So species that we call a certain thing, like, you know, mammals or whatever, and we call them tigers and lions and whatever. But what you haven't got is that it could be that, so for example, between a lion and a tiger, or between a gorilla and us, that there's been gradually a continuum of changes, and it's just that we don't have the fossils for the ones that are in the middle, so they just look like the discrete species, but they're actually not. They're on a continuum, and therefore we're on a continuum with everything in the animal kingdom, but we just don't have the fossils for the ones that are in the middle. Because obviously when fossils get laid down, you know, you've got to rely on the animals dying and having the right conditions to be fossilised. and there's too many to fossilise and survive, and it's all very complicated. Like, you know, you would have lots of missing ones. Like, we've only got what's left, we haven't got all the ones that we haven't got, you know. And also the discussion of where there's been divergent species that are completely unrelated, but they look like they're related because they have very similar characteristics. So for example, there are, I think the example that he uses is there's a fish that has been, basically it had gone into the sea and had been, you know, in the depths of the sea, and so hadn't evolved. But there was another species that had evolved loads, but it had evolved to the point where this one was, and this one hadn't evolved. So they looked very similar and similar characteristics, but they were distinct, different, completely species. So they weren't actually related. And this has happened as well in terms of, so for example, you get similar species in Africa to Australia, but they're not closely related. They're from a completely, you know, distant ancestor, and they're a divergent species, and so therefore they look like they're very similar, but they're not. And I think it was like the armadillo and the porcupine, or some kind of animal like that, where they look very similar but they're not related at all. Like, they're from two divergent, you know, they might have had a common ancestor yonks back, but they don't have a common ancestor currently in the way that they're taxonomizing, because again, there's lots of different ways to taxonomize, and so that's not completely scientific either. So we're dealing with a lot of things that we don't have enough evidence to provide actually conclusive theories. We know that evolution happens, and we've got things like cumulative selection and stuff from the fossil records that we're looking at, but things like, is it continuum, is it, you know, are there discrete species and things, we couldn't possibly answer that because we don't have a complete fossil record. So yeah, very interesting. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because a lot of this stuff I did already know from reading The Selfish Gene, and because of the style of Richard Dawkins, and because it was a middling book. Like, there wasn't anything in this that I found challenging, that I found like, wow, like, this is amazing. I'm really loving it. And so that's kind of why I gave it that. I realised I was earning loads then. The God Delusion is my favourite, but that was because at the time I was going through an atheist crisis. So it probably wouldn't be if I read it again. So I would recommend it. I mean, I think maybe you need to read The Selfish Gene before you read this one, because I think that this would fall on deaf ears a little bit if you didn't have that kind of underpinning of knowledge from the other one. If you want something that's really complex and really complicated, something that was far beyond my intellectual level, The Extended Phenotype is one that's the hardest one from him that I've read. So if you find like this is too easy for you, and you know, you want a better intellectual read, then Extended Phenotype might be your bag. Very heavy on biology and maths, but again, if that's your subject, it probably wouldn't be difficult for you anyway. So yeah, I'd probably recommend it. It's interesting, gave me a different viewpoint on evolution, but if you don't like Dawkins, you won't like it, because it's just like, you know, the style of it is just like his other ones. It's very patronising at times. So